Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving into part 2 of the Susan Cox Powell case. And if you haven't listened to the first part yet, then you've missed a lot. So, as per usual, I would highly suggest you go back and check that out because we covered a lot in part 1, and we're going to be covering a lot more in part 2. This will probably be a 3-parter. I'm going to try to make sure that next week is the last week. Again, I was trying really hard not to make this a multi-part case, but here we are. I did also want to mention that I went this week and I upgraded everything. New mic, new headphones, the works. So I'm really hoping that this audio sounds better than usual. Please let me know. Please, God, let me know. I spent so much money that I could have cried. But it's fine. We're doing it for the gram, or whatever the kids say. So, with all that being said and without further ado, let's get it. So, last week we left off with Susan being reported missing and police coming in to take a look around at the house. They found her purse, her wallet, her keys, just everything that she would have normally left the house with. All of those things were still inside, and on top of all that, Susan and Josh, along with their 2 kids, Charlie and Brayden, were also nowhere in the house. So, that's where we left off. So let's jump back into the timeline of where we were. Because after finding all of Susan's stuff in the house, and after calling around to everyone who was close with Susan and Josh, and after checking the local hospitals and searching for the license plate of the Powell family van, just to make sure that it hadn't been in some sort of accident, and after finding no new information, this is kind of when the West Valley City police officers decided that it was probably time to call in people who were better equipped to handle this type of situation. And they ended up with Detective Ellis Maxwell, who turns out to be a real badass in this case. But once Detective Ellis Maxwell arrives on scene, there were officers and family members and friends all parked and standing around outside. And Detective Ellis Maxwell was a little bit pissed that Josh's mom and sister had been allowed to just kind of trample all over the inside of the house. And that they had been allowed to go inside and touch all these things that could potentially be key pieces of evidence. But there was really nothing he could do about that now, so one of the first things that he did do was place Josh, Susan, Charlie, and Brayden Powell, along with the family minivan, on the NCIC list, which is the National Crime Information Center database. And by putting the Powell family and their van on this list, any officers in the country that ran the names or the vehicles of that license plate would automatically be alerted that they were reported missing, and it would also give the officer that ran that information, Detective Ellis Maxwell's information, to be able to reach out to him and alert him that he'd either spotted one of the Powell family members or their van. But Detective Ellis Maxwell hadn't even made it out of his patrol car and into the Powell house when he got a knock on his car window. This knock had come from Giovanna, who, remember, was the neighbor that had been over helping Susan untangle her ball of yarn when she was presumably also one of the last people to have seen Susan alive. Giovanna told Detective Ellis Maxwell that she had actually just gotten off the phone with Josh, so as it turns out of all the people that had been blowing up Josh's phone all morning, he did actually answer when Giovanna called. And she just kind of told him, Josh, we think Susan is missing, and also the police are at your house and you probably want to hurry up and get home. Josh told Giovanna not to worry about it too much because Susan was probably just at work and that he would be home shortly. But while Josh was on the phone with Giovanna, he never mentioned that he had Charlie and Brayden with him. So once Detective Ellis Maxwell knew that Josh was at least answering phone calls now, he gave Josh a call too. Detective Maxwell told Josh that they had obviously already checked Susan's place of work and that she was definitely missing, so he probably would want to hurry up and get home. After this short call, the two hung up, and it would end up being like another 3 hours or so before Josh would finally show up at home to meet with the detective. Now, what police didn't know at the time, but something that we would learn later, is that right after Josh hung up with Detective Ellis Maxwell after this first phone call, that Josh, who had been previously driving towards his house while he was on the phone with Detective Ellis Maxwell, but once that call was over, Josh turned his minivan around and started driving in the opposite direction of his house for about 20 miles. And while Josh is driving in the opposite direction of his house, he calls Susan's phone, and when she doesn't answer, he leaves her a voicemail. And in this voicemail, Josh says that he's on his way home with the boys and that he hopes that she made it to work okay. Now, I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but December 7th, which is the day that Susan was reported missing, was also a Monday. Because, good Lord, that ends up becoming a really important piece of information in this case later on. Now, keep in mind two things here. Firstly, Josh had literally just gotten off the phone with Giovanna and Detective Ellis Maxwell, who both told him that Susan was missing and that she hadn't made it to work. And secondly, that he had literally turned his vehicle around to drive in the opposite direction of his house, but then in the voicemail that he left on Susan's phone, he says that he's on his way home with the boys. And it's like, no, Josh, you were actually on your way home before you did a complete U-turn to cover your ass. So, spoiler alert here, if you don't know anything about this case, the husband definitely did it. And he most likely had help from a few other people. But I'm getting ahead because we'll get there. So Josh turns his minivan back around to drive towards his house again after he turned around to leave the voicemail on Susan's phone. Josh stopped and got Charlie and Braden something to eat, and he didn't show up at his house to meet with the detective until hours and hours after learning that Susan was missing. And it was during this drive back home to meet up with the detective that Josh called his sister Jennifer. And when Jennifer asked Josh where he had been and where Susan and the boys were, Josh told Jennifer that he was at work and that he had the boys with him and that they were fine. Now, we know this is a lie, and Jennifer knew this was a lie. Josh hadn't gone to work that day, and she knew that. So, once he was caught in this lie, Josh then claimed that he had taken the boys on this spur-of-the-moment camping trip. So, already we're catching Josh in his own lies. And then Jennifer asked where Susan was. And Josh told her that he guessed that Susan was at work, also saying that Susan hadn't gone on this impromptu camping trip. And again, Jennifer knew this was a lie. And she pushed Josh a little further, asking him where Susan was. Josh told his sister that he didn't know where Susan was, but then he asked Jennifer what all she knew. And this is when Jennifer said that for the second time that day that she had this unnerving feeling that Josh had done something to Susan. But Jennifer also didn't want Josh to try to run off with the boys, so she tried to keep her composure while she kept talking to Josh. And she just kind of gave Josh a brief rundown of what had happened so far. And Jennifer asked Josh if he will meet her at his house where the police are, and Josh agrees. Now, once Jennifer hangs up the phone with Josh, she calls Detective Ellis Maxwell to let him know that she had been able to get in touch with Josh, and she had been able to talk Josh into meeting her at at his house. So now Jennifer and Detective Ellis Maxwell are both planning to meet up with Josh at his house that he shared with Susan. So once Detective Ellis Maxwell and Jennifer arrive at the Powell house, where they were supposed to be meeting Josh at, they wait, and wait, and wait. Detective Ellis Maxwell tried to give Josh a call again, but he didn't answer. So then Jennifer tried calling Josh, and he answered this time. And Jennifer just handed the detective the phone. So Detective Ellis Maxwell explains that they had been at Josh's house for 8 or 9 hours at this point, and that Josh needed to get home. Josh completely ignores Detective Ellis Maxwell and instead tells him that he has to feed the boys. And instead of just listening to the detective talk, Josh talks over him, asking if the boys want pizza for dinner or, what they would rather have for dinner. Detective Ellis Maxwell tells Josh to grab the boys something to eat on the go, and then he tells Josh that the kids can eat once they get back home where he and Jennifer are waiting for him and the boys to show up. Josh agrees and he hangs up the phone. But he still doesn't show up for more than an hour after this. So Josh, when he does finally show up to meet with Detective Ellis Maxwell and his sister Jennifer, it ended up being like 8 or 9 hours after the police had initially shown up at the Powell house to report, for the report of the family being missing. And after Josh finally decided to show up to see what was going on with his missing wife, Detective Ellis Maxwell asked Josh to follow him to the police station so that they could go over the last time that he saw Susan. And the strangest thing is that Josh does go to the police station for questioning, but he also takes his sons Charlie and Braden along with him. And Charlie and Braden were super young at the time that Susan was reported missing. I think Charlie was 4 and Braden was like 2. So for this entire time that Detective Ellis Maxwell was talking to Josh and questioning him about the last time that he'd seen Susan, Josh would kind of interrupt these questions and tell Charlie not to touch this or ask Braden not to do that. It was almost like he was using the boys as a shield from having to answer any questions. Josh claimed that the last time that he had seen Susan was the night before at around midnight, and when Josh was asked what Susan was wearing, he just says I don't know, something comfortable, I guess. And this is where things start to differ a little bit. Josh claims that he didn't leave the house at the same time as Giovanna. Instead, Josh says that after making pancakes and eggs for dinner and cleaning up the dishes, that Susan went to take a nap, that she hadn't been feeling well. So Susan went to take a nap and Giovanna left. But according to Josh, he and the boys never left at 5 or 5:30 when Giovanna herself saw him and the boys pulling out of the driveway. So I believe Giovanna on this one. Josh also claims that Susan woke up at about 6:30 p.m., that she ate a hot dog before she laid back down. Now, this is another time that Josh's story differs. So when he's talking to police, Josh says that after Susan ate her hot dog, she went to lay back down, that he took Charlie sledding, and that he didn't take Braden with him. Now, Giovanna distinctly recalled seeing Josh buckle both Charlie and Braden up into their car seats before leaving the house to go sledding at 5:30 p.m. But now Josh is trying to tell Detective Ellis Maxwell that he was home until he took Charlie sledding. And then Josh says that he and Charlie got back home at around 8 p.m., and Josh claims to have read the boys a book before putting them to bed. And then, y'all, Josh tells Detective Ellis Maxwell that at about 10 p.m. that same night, that Susan asked Josh to cross off one of those things on her honey-do list. Any guesses on what Susan supposedly asked Josh to do at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night? Because if you guessed scrubbing the couch and leaving it saturated in sopping water wet, then you would be absolutely correct. Let's be so fucking for real. And I'm not the only one that wasn't buying this. Nobody was buying this. Josh says that he used a rug doctor to clean the couch, so like a carpet cleaner type of deal. And this is where I personally crown Josh Powell as the worst liar to ever walk the earth. But let's keep going, because Josh then claims that Susan knew all about this camping trip and that she was totally fine with Josh taking their 2 and 4-year-old out in the middle of the night on a Sunday when he was supposed to work the next day and the boys were supposed to be in daycare the next day. And oh yeah, by the way, she was supposedly fine with all of this, even though there was supposed to be a hellacious snowstorm coming in that same night that Josh had planned to take Charlie and Braden camping. And also, didn't Josh already tell someone that this camping trip wasn't planned? Okay, because I thought so. So it wasn't planned, but Susan knew about it and was okay with it. Okay, cool. I thought so. Now, this entire time, Detective Ellis Maxwell is asking Josh questions. You can hear Charlie and Braden in the background, chatting, talking, playing, whatever. So much so that Detective Ellis Maxwell ends up having to bring someone in to kind of entertain the boys. And when it was time for Josh to explain what route he had driven to get to this campsite, and if or where he had made any stops along the way, the only real answers that Josh gives when he answers these questions are I'm not sure, or I don't know, or I don't know, I can't really remember, or I'm not sure. Josh never gave real answers as to where he went, where they stayed, where he stopped for gas, anything like that. And then when Detective Ellis Maxwell asked Josh why he had decided to take Charlie and Braden camping in the middle of the night, when he had to work the next morning, and when the boys had daycare the next morning, in the middle of a blizzard, Josh again gives the worst lie for an excuse that I've ever heard. Because Josh tells Detective Ellis Maxwell that he had actually just gotten his days mixed up. So simple as that. You see, Josh was thinking this whole time that he had taken the boys camping in the middle of the night on Saturday night. Okay, I get it. But then, Josh says that the next morning when he woke up, that's when he realized that it was actually Monday and not Sunday like he'd originally thought. And that was when he realized that he had mixed his days up. I mean, it happens to all of us, I guess. Now, Josh then says that he stopped at a car wash on the way back home from this camping trip, which also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do, just because the roads would have still been covered in, like, snow and mud slush, and washing the car would have been completely pointless. So, Detective Ellis Maxwell asked which car wash he'd stopped at, and of course, Josh claims not to remember. And this is just kind of Josh's thing. If he doesn't remember anything, or if he doesn't want you to know that he remembered something, he just kind of goes with, I don't know. And it's kind of hard for Detective Ellis Maxwell to poke holes in a story like this, because Josh has only given him, like, the bare bone basics of every event that he's retelling. Josh doesn't seem to be worried about Susan at all. He wasn't calling hospitals. He wasn't blowing Susan's phone up. He wasn't offering up ideas and ways to help the detectives look for her. He just wasn't helping with anything. And I don't know about y'all, but I would like to think that if my husband came home from work today and I was gone and no one had seen me all day, that he would burn this entire city down trying to find me. He would tell the police anywhere that I might have gone, any of my favorite places. He would be doing the absolute most. And here Josh is not even doing the bare minimum. So finally, Detective Ellis Maxwell is just kind of fed up with the way that Josh isn't even pretending to care. And a very determined Detective Ellis Maxwell just finally asked Josh if he can look through his minivan before he left. And Josh surprisingly agreed to let the detectives look through his van. Now, early on during this first questioning, Detective Ellis Maxwell had asked Josh if he knew where Susan's phone was, because her phone hadn't been found at the house with her purse and her other things. And Josh had said that he had no idea where her phone could be. But just a little while later, after still not getting much information out of Josh, Detective Ellis Maxwell gets Josh to sign the paper agreeing to the search of the minivan, under the condition that Josh would be able to stand by and watch the search, and that he would also be able to stop the search at any point for any reason. Which again is suspicious, but sometimes you gotta take it how you can get it. So the search of the van begins, and there was a ton of stuff found, so I'm just gonna list like a few. They found a big blue plastic tarp that was laid over the back carpet of the van, and on top of that blue tarp was a rake, a shovel, a broom, and a plastic tote with a few miscellaneous camping supplies like bug spray, a poncho, toilet paper, etc. So essentially, a how to bury your wife kit was just kind of sprawled out in the back floorboard of Josh's van. Detectives also found a circular saw and an extension cord, a handsaw, a box cutter, and a few other small things, along with a gas can and a generator. There were also extra changes of clothes for both Charlie and Braden, and a blanket that would fit a queen-size bed in the back. And then in the middle console of the van was Susan's cell phone. The same cell phone that Josh had just said he didn't know where it was. And the same pink Motorola cell phone that Josh had driven 20 miles in the opposite direction of home to call, just so that he could make sure that there was a voicemail from him on Susan's phone for the police to later find. But he had Susan's phone inside of the van the entire time. I don't know about y'all, but something's smelling fishy to me. So when Detective Ellis Maxwell asked Josh why he had Susan's phone, Josh said that he actually forgot that he had borrowed Susan's cell phone the day before so that he could get a few numbers that he needed off of it, and then he just must have forgotten that he had it altogether. which also isn't very believable. And this was the time before your cell phone was attached to your body. But it's really only weird because of where the phone was found in the middle console. So there was a small compartment for like maybe loose change, and then you would actually have to lift up that change cubby and then go way deeper down into the console so that bigger items could fit. So Josh would have had to have moved the compartment that holds like your quarters and dimes, and he would have had to have put Susan's cell phone way down into the bottom of that middle console, and then had to put like the change holder back on top where he had stashed Susan's cell phone away. So there's really it's not like he just tossed it in there. He would have actually had to physically move things a few times to get it into that spot in the middle console. So after this, Detective Ellis Maxwell told Josh that he and the boys could head home, but that Josh needed to immediately find a sitter for Charlie and Braden, and Josh said that he had planned to be back at the station by 9 a.m. the next morning. But again, Josh is a liar, and Detective Ellis Maxwell doesn't exactly have enough evidence to arrest Josh or charge him with anything at this point, so he really had no choice but to let Josh leave with his two sons. So Josh and the kids arrived back to their house about 12 hours after Susan had been reported missing. And the following morning, when Josh was supposed to line up a sitter for Charlie and Braden so that he could meet with Detective Ellis Maxwell at 9 a.m. at the station for another round of questioning. So at about 8 a.m., Detective Ellis Maxwell just gave Josh a call to confirm their 9 a.m. meetup. Of course, there was no answer when Detective Maxwell called Josh. But we know that Josh was home at 8 a.m. that morning because Josh's neighbor reported seeing Josh outside cleaning the inside of the minivan at like 8 a.m., likely wiping and scrubbing away any physical DNA evidence. So after not getting an answer from Josh when he called, Detective Maxwell reached out to Josh's sister Jennifer, who let him know that she had agreed to meet up with Josh so that she could keep the boys while Josh went to the police station. And Josh's sister Jennifer says that when she did show up at Josh's house to babysit for him, that Josh was just like running around the house cleaning things, doing laundry, and that he just seemed really unbothered by the fact that his wife was missing, and also pretty unbothered by the fact that he was already super late for his 9 a.m. meetup with Detective Ellis Maxwell. And it actually took some convincing on Jennifer's part to get Josh to even go to the police station, but Josh didn't end up meeting with Detective Ellis Maxwell until after 12 p.m. Mind you, he was supposed to have been there at 9 a.m., not 12 p.m. So as soon as Josh and Detective Ellis Maxwell sit down for this interview, Josh lets the detective know that he had contacted his attorney and that they had advised him not to speak with any police further without his attorney being present. But after about 30 minutes of the detective trying to explain to Josh that he didn't have anything to worry about if he hadn't done anything to Susan, which, that makes sense. If you didn't do anything, why are you so worried about it? And finally, a sniffling but never actually crying Josh agreed to answer some questions. And this is one of the weirdest questionings you will ever hear. Josh answers most of the detective's questions, but only after he takes a super, super long and super uncomfortable pause. And then when Josh would answer questions, it was almost always with short 1 or 2 word answers. And after Josh would answer these questions, he would throw out some little random fact or detail that has absolutely nothing to do with anything that he's being questioned about. So Josh is asked to explain what he, Susan, and the kids had done on the day before Susan went missing. But Josh claims to not really remember a lot of what they did or where they went or what they talked about. Basically, Josh had a very convenient case of amnesia. And when Detective Ellis Maxwell asked if Susan had been upset with Josh about taking their 2 young kids out in a snowstorm so late at night on a Sunday night when they both had to work the next day, Josh claimed that he thought that it was actually Saturday night, and then said that Susan must not have realized that it was actually Sunday also. So now Josh is claiming that both he and Susan must have mistaken what day of the week it was when Josh took their kids camping during a blizzard. Josh claimed that he didn't remember how far he'd driven or when it had started snowing or basically anything else that could have possibly been useful. At one point, Josh even claimed that he didn't remember where they stopped to camp at. But according to the Cold podcast, the road that Josh claimed to have taken to get to this campsite, there's only one official campsite that would have been anywhere near where Josh claimed that he and the kids were. And this would have been a free campsite for the public. So this would have been right up Josh's alley because we know he's a cheapskate unless it's for himself. So this is hypothetically possible. And this is the campsite that Josh said that he and the kids stopped at, and according to Josh, he and the boys didn't make their campsite until about 4 a.m. early Monday morning. Now, you tell me who the hell is taking their 2- and 4-year-old kids camping during a trip that was never planned in the middle of a snowstorm and arriving at 4 a.m. Because I don't know a single soul who would be doing this. But the campsite and the time that he would have driven there, along with the time that he claimed to have left the house where, mind you, Susan was sick, the timing does kind of work out where Josh would have made it to this hypothetical campsite at around 4 a.m. So, not only did he take his kids camping during a snowstorm in the middle of the night, he also left his sick wife, who hadn't been feeling well at home, alone to have to ride her bike to work the next morning in the snow. Because again, they did only have one vehicle, so this totally sounds believable so far. Josh claimed that the next morning he had gotten up at about 7 a.m., so he went to sleep sometime after 4 a.m. when they set up camp, and then woke up at 7 a.m. Okay. Josh then says that after he wakes up that he and the kids a fire and they roasted marshmallows. So he fed his 2- and 4-year-old sons the breakfast of champions, I guess. Now, after marshmallows, Josh says that he and the boys explored their campsite for a little while before they headed back to the minivan and drove down a bunch of random-ass trails and roads that Josh had never been down before, and for who knows what reason, honestly. Josh claims that they just drove around aimlessly for a while until about 12 p.m. before stopping at a random car wash along the route home. And because Josh was driving aimlessly down different trails and roads that he'd never been down before, he conveniently had no idea where this car wash was, what the name of it was, what town it was in, or even what road it was on. And again, this sounds like a good way to get rid of evidence, especially if you conveniently can't remember where the car wash was, or what it was called, or even what town it was in. I would imagine that it would be pretty hard to track down a car wash with absolutely no indicator as to where it is, how far away it is, or even what town it's in. That seems impossible. And this just proves that Josh isn't as dumb as he sounds, and sadly, that ends up helping him through this entire investigation into Susan's disappearance. Now, it was during this interview with Detective Ellis Maxwell where he asked Josh what he thought might have happened to Susan. And all Josh says is that he doesn't really think that Susan would have left on her own. And then he even acknowledges that the spouse and the people closest to a missing person are usually the first people to be looked at. Because statistically, those are the people who are most likely responsible for whatever happened to the victim. Now, after this, Detective Ellis Maxwell figures that now is probably a good time to switch the line of questioning over from small talk to investigatory type of questions. But in order to do that, the detective also has to figure out a way to read Josh his Miranda rights so that later on, if this were to ever go to trial, that a defense attorney wouldn't be able to have this kind of questioning struck from the record of even being able to be used as evidence. So if Detective Maxwell doesn't read him his Miranda rights, then all of these questions that he answers, no matter if he confessed, probably likely would be thrown out of a trial by the defense attorney. So Detective Ellis Maxwell has to read Josh his Miranda rights in a way that it doesn't freak Josh out and it doesn't make him think that he's about to be arrested. And Ellis Maxwell does such a good job with this. He explains everything to Josh and makes sure to reiterate the fact that Josh is not under arrest. And he says over and over and over again, like, you're here voluntarily, you can leave anytime. And thank God Detective Ellis Maxwell could see through Josh's fake worried husband act. So he tells Josh that he needs to read him his Miranda rights, And Josh goes straight into this like, well, maybe I need an attorney, or I've already told you everything I know. And that's when Detective Ellis Maxwell drops a bombshell. He basically went from, I'm on your side and I want to help you, to, I know you're full of shit and I'm going to prove it. Because Detective Ellis Maxwell then explains to Josh that he wouldn't be allowed to go back to his house for a while because the house was now part of the investigation into Susan's disappearance. But that wasn't all, though. He also let Josh know that the family minivan was also evidence in this investigation, and that Josh wouldn't be able to drive the minivan anymore until they were done with their, searches and collecting evidence. And after Detective Ellis Maxwell reads Josh his Miranda rights 2 different times, Josh was all of a sudden, not sure if he wanted to continue questioning. And the detective is just kind of like, Josh, your wife is missing. You don't have days to think about whether or not you want to cooperate with the questions that we need answers to in order to find your missing wife. So instead of giving him days, the detective tells Josh to think about it for a few minutes and let him know whether or not he wants to continue with this question, and he walks out of the room, kind of leaving Josh to himself. But when Detective Ellis Maxwell actually walks out of the interrogation room, that's when he learned that Josh's sister Jennifer, she was definitely on the side of the police, and she definitely wanted answers as to what happened to Susan, and she didn't really care if that meant having to betray her own brother. And this is what I meant last week when I said that Jennifer is a real badass, because we know that Jennifer left Charlie and Braden with his sister Jennifer and his mom while he went to the police station to talk to the detectives. And while Josh was gone, Jennifer let officers know that she thought that Josh had possibly done something to Susan, and she just basically told them that she didn't think that it was as cut and dry as Susan just vanishing into thin air, and the police didn't think that either. Especially after they'd seen how Josh reacted during his questioning, he was just emotionless and cold the entire time. Like he could care less that his wife and the mother of his children was missing. So while Jennifer still had the kids, and while Josh was still at the police station, she let police know that she would do whatever she needed in order to help. So police asked Jennifer if she could take Charlie and Braden to the Children's Justice Center nearby to be questioned, and she does. Now, mind you, all of this is happening while Josh is still back at the police station being questioned. So Josh has no idea that his sister Jennifer has just taken his boys to essentially be questioned about their camping trip. And when Charlie, who was the oldest, he was 4, almost 5 years old. But when he was being talked to by the Children's Justice Center, Charlie said that Susan had actually gone camping with them. But then he says that his mommy stayed at the place with the shiny rocks and the pretty flowers. Now, Josh and Susan's oldest son is basically telling detectives that Susan went with them on this late-ass camping trip the night before, but that she didn't come back home with them. And as soon as Detective Ellis Maxwell hears this, he goes back in to let Josh know that his kids have been questioned. They took Josh's phone, and Josh immediately said that he was done talking and that he was leaving. And there really wasn't much that detectives could do, to keep him from leaving. They had been telling Josh throughout this entire 4-hour interview that he was free to leave whenever he wanted, but there still wasn't any physical evidence that Josh had done something to Susan. Nothing really aside from taking a 4-year-old at face value. But that would never be enough to hold up in court. Detectives had found no physical evidence. There was no eyewitness sightings that saw Susan with Josh and the kids on this camping trip. And while Susan was missing, there was no body that had been found. So after Josh left the police station, police went to talk to the people that worked with Susan. And this is when they learned that Susan kept a file in her drawer at her desk at the bank. And when police are given access to that drawer with those files, that drawer was filled with journal entries and emails and paperwork from divorce lawyers and just all sorts of things that all said the same thing. They all essentially said that if something ever happened to Susan, that Josh was responsible. The emails were sent to and from different people where Susan describes how she wasn't happy in her marriage anymore. The journal entries were all describing different arguments that she and Josh had gone through and what they were about. So again, none of this really looks good for Josh, but it's still not enough to charge him with anything. And after going through the things that Susan kept away from Josh because she kept them in her desk at work, The detectives went back to the police station to write up a search warrant for the house that the Powell family lived in and the minivan that the Powell family drove. Josh had left the interrogation room at about 4:15 p.m. on Tuesday after finding out that his sons had been questioned. But the detectives had Josh's van to search through it as evidence, so Josh didn't have a vehicle to leave. And he also didn't have a phone to call anyone for a ride. But Detective Ellis Maxwell seems to have done this for a reason, though, and it seems like he wanted Josh to stick around at the police station long enough for the officers to search through the family's van, and then they would give the van back to Josh, and the detectives would be able to give Josh the van back after they searched it because a judge had granted access for a tracking device to be put on the family van. So the detectives were hoping that they would give Josh the van back after they searched it, and then they would be able to put an undercover car on Josh to follow him, and they kind of hoped that Josh would unknowingly lead them right to where he had Susan's body hid. But that didn't work out the way that detectives thought it would. Josh had already cleaned the van out from all the weird shit that was in the van before, and there wasn't really anything that was found in the van that could help. So detectives were off to the family house to search there. And obviously, this search focused a lot on the couch in the house that had been weirdly cleaned at like 10 p.m. at night. That would be the same couch that had the 2 fans blowing on it to try to dry off the cleaning solution in water. And once they sprayed everything with luminol to try to find any blood that had been left behind or traces of blood that had been cleaned up, they only found a few drops of blood that showed up on the tile floor in between the couch and the front door. But even Detective Ellis Maxwell describes these droplets of blood as being smaller than a ballpoint pen. So there were a few droplets of blood, but they were microscopically tiny. Police sprayed the couch for traces of blood, and the only thing that showed up on the couch was a small swipe of blood. But this still wasn't enough blood to indicate that someone had been murdered inside the house. And it was such a weirdly small amount of blood that was found, it just didn't make sense to try to arrest him on that. Detectives also took 5 computers and 7 hard drives from the Powell family house, and Detective Ellis Maxwell thought that this would be a good way to move forward with the evidence as far as what could be on the electronics goes. And they would later learn that even though they had taken Josh's phone before he left the interrogation room at the police station, Josh had somehow managed to sneak his SIMS card out of his phone before he handed it over to police. So the phone was likely useless without the SIMS card data to go through, because this was a time before our phones held all of its data on the phone itself. This is when we had to back everything up, or save it to a SIMS card or a hard drive stick. Nothing was actually saved on the phones itself back then. So this whole time that detectives were searching Josh's van and his house, his sons Charlie and Braden were still with his sister Jennifer. And it was kind of weird because Josh had sat in the waiting room of the police station almost the entire time that the searches were being done. So the searches on his van and his house, he's just chilling in the waiting room at the police station. And of course Josh didn't know that the judge had signed off on a tracking device being placed on Josh's van. And detectives were doing this in hopes that Josh would be freaked out enough to lead them right to Susan. So all evening, Josh just sat in the waiting room. But at about 9:40 p.m., when Detective Ellis Maxwell walked into the waiting room with the keys to Josh's minivan equipped with a brand new tracking device, Josh wasn't there anymore. He hadn't said anything, nobody saw him leave, he was just gone. So the tracking device wasn't going to lead detectives anywhere without Josh leading them there. And what had happened is Josh had gotten a taxi and asked the taxi driver to take him to the Salt Lake City International Airport. But Josh wasn't running. Instead, he had the taxi driver drop him off at the airport where there was also a Hertz rental car company. Josh paid for a rental car, which was a silver Ford Focus. And after he paid for the car and drove off the lot, we'll probably never learn what Josh did after this. Because Josh didn't go home, and he didn't go pick up his kids from his sister Jennifer. But detectives had planned on being able to follow Josh after he finally left the police station. But since he didn't end up waiting on the search of his van to be done, and since no one knew that Josh had rented a car until much, much later, No one followed Josh to anywhere he went after he rented that car. Because detectives didn't even know that Josh had rented a car until later on in the investigation. And while they didn't know that Josh had rented a car, they were still searching for Susan. They had helicopters overhead to look for anything suspicious. They walked a few spots that Josh had named specifically, but there wasn't anything they could find. Except for one sheep herder who did say that he saw a white man driving a navy blue minivan on the day that Josh claimed to have been there. This would have been on the route that Josh supposedly took to get to this alleged campsite, and he also drove a blue minivan. So, there's that. And this was in the spot where Josh claimed, somewhere close to the spot where Josh had claimed to have been. Now, it was another 18 hours after Josh drove off the airport lot with his rental car before anyone saw or heard from him again. Josh hadn't called his sister to get his kids. He did tell her that he rode by the house at like 1 a.m., but everybody was asleep and the lights are off, which we know is a lie because his sister said so. She had been up all night, worried sick. So she wasn't in the bed and the lights weren't off. But Josh had driven that rental car 807 miles over the course of those 18 hours. And when Josh purchased a new cell phone and activated it, he was a lot closer to his dad's house, which is about 80 miles away from where he and Susan lived. And no one knows where Josh drove that rental car to or how the hell he put 807 miles on it, or what he had been doing those 18 hours that he was missing for. And sadly, we'll probably never get those answers now. But what we do know is that Josh's dad, Steve, who remember was also in love and obsessed with Susan, so yes, Steve had also missed work for the 3 days that Susan had been missing for. But Steve's cell phone records show that he was in Washington where he lived the entire time. Except for there is one chunk of time that even Steve is unaccounted for. And that lapse of time that Steve was unaccounted for was also during the same 18-hour window where Josh was unaccounted for and driving around 800 and something miles in this rental car. This makes me believe that Steve definitely helped Josh do whatever he did during that rental car drive in those 18 hours. And as we get further into this case, it will become so clear that Josh did, in fact, have help from certain family members of his. And I will say Josh's sister Jennifer, she was one of the only ones on Josh's side of the family who was on Susan's side, no matter how much strain it put on her relationship with Josh or really any other member of the family that may have helped Josh. Like, Jennifer was burning bridges and wrecking relationships with family members to try to help get justice for Susan. Now, this is already longer than I expected, so let me just say that the detectives in this case never stopped searching for leads. They literally scoured the desert looking for either Susan's remains or at least clues as to where she might be. And a lot of these searches were done kind of in secret. Like, they weren't really made public, and a lot of the searches were done because detectives were able to kind of track Josh using the tracking device once he returned the rental car and once he got his minivan back. So they'd follow Josh, and anytime he stopped or pulled over for a long period of time, police would use those coordinates and send officers and dogs out to search those areas. But Josh was doing more weird shit besides just driving around aimlessly and stopping at seemingly random spots for no reason. He also went by the daycare that Charlie and Braden, his sons, attended before Susan's disappearance. And he went to the daycare to gather all of his sons' belongings. He also called over the next few days and canceled all of Susan's upcoming appointments. And Josh was doing stuff like this within the first, 5 to 7 days that Susan had been reported missing. Like, a lot of people still have hope that their family members are going to return at, the 5 to 7 day mark. I've covered cases where people over the course of 12 years or 20 years are still waiting on their family members to return. So it's kind of weird that even after just a few days, Josh is like, meh, she's not coming back. Cancel her appointments. Let's change our whole life. So after this, detectives got the proper paperwork to be able to search the workplace of both Josh and Susan separately. This is when detectives discovered Susan's safe deposit box and her handwritten will, along with the savings bonds and other important documents that she had stored away in that box. But the two most important things that were found in that safe deposit box was the video that Susan had made of all the family's assets and the letter that said something along the lines of like, if something happens to me, look at Josh first. And it seems like at this point, detectives were working on a theory that Josh had probably poisoned Susan when he made that dinner of pancakes and eggs, which would have made it super easy for him to be able to do whatever he did to her. And Susan's parents were, just like everyone else, extremely suspicious of Josh. And when Josh's sister Jennifer told detectives about her and Josh's dad Steve being completely obsessed with Susan, naturally, detectives wanted to talk to Steve. Because what father-in-law is obsessed and infatuated with their own daughter-in-law? When detectives questioned Steve, he was obviously quick to tell detectives that he and Susan had this electric spark and a lot of other creepy things that he felt about Susan. And then Steve told detectives that he had been trying to talk Josh into moving he and the kids back to his house, back to Steve's house. Susan had only been missing for 10 days at this point, so why was Steve so sure that Susan wasn't coming back? Probably because Steve knew that Susan was dead and he knew that she wasn't coming back. And just like that, on Saturday, December 19th, 2009, Josh packed up himself and both boys and all of their belongings and headed to live with Josh's dad, Steve, at his house. Now, on the 19th, when Josh packed up he and all the boys' stuff to move from their house back to Steve's house, Susan had only been missing for 12 days. So, again, why was Josh so sure that Susan wasn't coming back? Probably for the same reason that Steve knew that Susan wasn't coming back. Because the two of them were either the ones that killed her or helped dispose of her remains. And that's where we're going to stop this for this week. Oh my gosh, there's so much more. I am going to wrap this up in a third part because I did not want to drag this out into like a 5 or 6 part series. So I'm going to wrap it up next week and then we'll move on to a different case after that. Also, I listened back to the first half of this episode. I haven't listened back to the second half yet. But I hear cracks in the audio or I don't know, the cords being moved or something. I don't know. I still have tweaking to do. I have not figured out this new setup completely. But I did want to get you an episode out today and I did want to try it with the better audio equipment. So, give me time to work out the kinks and the bugs and figure this out. And please, please, please drop me some feedback on the audio. Is it better, worse, love it, hate it? Any suggestions, any feedback, any criticism? I'll take it. And with that, if you want more episodes, you can join the Patreon family. The links are below. Follow on social medias. Do all the things I'm supposed to say. And let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.